Gilah Yelin Hirsch is a woman of many talents and facets, a filmmaker, a painter, a writer, and a professor of art. No one interview can do full justice to her. If I were to read her resume, I guess the entire interview time would be consumed. I welcome you, Gilah, on behalf of Punjab Lalit Kala Academy. So welcome to India and welcome to Chandigarh.
Thank you so much, Nonika, and thank you very much to this Punjab Lalit Kala Academy. And also I want to thank Jyotika Sehgal, who is responsible for all of this event in so many ways, and to Divan Mana, who has orchestrated all of the events here. It is a true honor for me to be here and also to bring my work to this other side of the world, because so much of my work was influenced by my coming here several times.
The pleasure is ours and the honor is also ours. So let's begin at the beginning. I believe as a child of 6 you wrote your first essay. So how important was that your childhood in shaping the person and the artist in you?
My childhood was truly the trigger in how I began to think about the world. The essay called Enigma was published in 4 languages, and it had to do with my questioning the fact that we had reached the height of civilization and that we still couldn't deal with love, food, and shelter. And I don't think we've done very well since.
So a child prodigy almost.
Yeah, well, under duress, and it was a very difficult childhood. So I was probing right from the beginning, and I was questioning all the time. And at 10, I wrote to Albert Einstein, having read that he is the smartest scientist in the world. And I thought maybe he could answer this question. And part of my questioning of the great scientist was I had read that he believed in the God of the Old Testament, and I couldn't understand how he could reconcile being a scientist and believing in God, particularly this God who created so much suffering, war, illness, and misdeeds in the world. I sent the letter, and my mother came home that day from teaching, and I said, I wrote a letter to Albert Einstein. And she, oh, you know, a busy man, don't get your hopes up. But she was a teacher, and she fished out the rough draft from the trash, which I have now. A week later, I got the response from Albert Einstein, and this became the guide of my life. And the key line in his letter to me was, always form your opinions according to your own judgment. You have shown in your letter that you're able to do so. Your friend, Albert Einstein. That was just a piece of it. But that phrase, always form your opinions according to your own judgment, remained with me as the guide in my life. He died just a couple of weeks after that. And I don't think it was cause and effect, but I am so grateful that I managed to have this tiny relationship from the great man.
Yeah, touch your life in some way.
Give me permission and encourage me to, if I had a good idea, or I thought I had an idea, pursue it all the way to the ends of the earth, and that's what I've been doing.
So that is where your correlation between science and art began?
Yes. And actually I didn't believe that I had no idea that I would ever become an artist. As a child, I wanted to be a writer and a psychologist. And it was only by accident that I became an artist. And this accident happened in that when I was in school, in college, university, I was already married, very young, and I received this scholarship from Stanford University to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology, which is what I thought I was going to do. But my then husband wanted to go to UCLA, where there was the first professor who was going to give the first PhD in computer-assisted instruction, which was a brand new field at the time. And so it was the time of follow your man. And on the strength of one painting class that I had as an art history major, I evolved 10 paintings and sent them in, applied for an MFA program without having any instruction ever as an artist. And I got in. And immediately, in the first year, my work was being shown in the Los Angeles County Museum. In the second year, it was in the Whitney Museum. And suddenly, I was all over the place as an artist. But my interest in science never flagged. And so the two branches evolved together.
Your first piece was called Enigma, and you describe your works as ineffable. Do you think mystique is at the core of all art?
Mystique or mystery or
Wonder?
I think great art is leaves so many layers to be discovered, and we never fully get the answer that we really want. And that's something I had to understand as a child. There are a few of my paintings in the latter years where I've been dealing with alphabet, and some of them are actual, some of them are made up. They look like written words, but they're not quite clear. And I think this is part of the inevitable search that humans, like we are, on our entire lives. We're looking for the answers, and there are no the answers. It's the process that's really important, the search.
So between the mystery of art and what a viewer is looking for in your art, how do you come to a ground where the two can meet?
Well, here's an example. This painting is called Reflections of Events in Time. And I realized that anytime there was a crossing of DNA, two strands of DNA, the Hebrew letter Aleph is formed. And the Aleph signifies the origin, the beginning. And it's used as metaphor for many different, let's say, researches in all different religions, etc. So that science of DNA creates the mystery, creates a sense of origin in many kinds of belief systems. And that would be a wedding of mysticism and science.
So alphabets have been part of your work. When did they come into it?
Pardon?
Alphabets.
Alphabets, okay. I had the great honor and pleasure of spending a lot of time alone in an artist colony in Southern California called Dorland Mountain Arts Colony. And there was a pond there. And I spent days, weeks, months, years alone looking at this pond as the reeds were breaking through the seasons, and as they broke, different patterns were evolving in the way that the reeds would break. And I was painting all these different seasons of the pond, and I was really fascinated by it. And as I looked across at the pond, it appeared to me that the reeds were breaking into 5 particular forms. And in fact, because I read many languages, I was able to read the landscape as it was being formed by the breaking of the reeds. Over a period of years, I determined that the 5 patterns were the straight line, the angle, the arc, the meander, and the X. And then I traveled all over the world looking and photographing alphabets worldwide, of ancient to modern languages, and found that these 5 forms were intrinsic in all alphabets. And then I made the connection, and this is the best part for me, that why did our ancestors, no matter where and who, pick these same 5 forms unconsciously to create their alphabets? And I understood that this was because these 5 forms mirror the shapes of neurons and neural processes of perception and cognition. So we are more alike than we're different. And this understanding gave me a cap to this theory that I had been evolving. And in 1981, I was first invited to present this theory at a conference of 100 scientists, and I thought that I would be booed off the stage. But on the contrary, it was fully accepted into science, and it became the groundwork for other theories that I've developed over the years. And I called it, at the time, Cosmography, the writing of the universe.
Interesting. You were saying that we are more alike than different, but you also say that while joy is cultural specific, grief is universal. Why? What makes you say that?
I'm glad you asked that question. And that particular answer I discovered in 1986-87 when I traveled alone in 15 Asian cultures. And as I moved from culture to culture, I realized that joy was determined culturally. For example, in one culture you wanted many husbands, another many wives, one you wanted sons, another daughters. The gods changed all the time. And yet, in every single culture, grief was experienced in exactly the same way. And grief has to do with loss of contact, rejection, and abandonment. And that was the great teaching for me from my first experiences living in so many cultures. And as I've lived in very many more ever since then, this has been affirmed over and over again.
You also say that canvas is a metaphor for you for delving into your own psyche. So can you elaborate on that?
Okay, you're asking very great questions, thank you. In the 70s, 1970, was the beginning of the feminist art movement, and I was one of the founders of the first feminist art movement, and we called this Los Angeles Council of Women Artists. As it happened, I was then in my second year graduate school in painting, MFA. And when I started the program, I had never drawn or painted before. I started by painting just layers of light and space, and they became immediately very well received. And then I thought, well, I was a cook, and I loved cooking, and I was cooking every week for 20 people at a time. And here was this fantastic palette of fruits and vegetables and foods of all sorts, and I started to paint them, but not like still life. I began to see them as metaphors of personality, particularly women, women's kitchen, where at that time the only place where women were allowed to paint was in the kitchen or the bedroom, and were never recognized as artists. So I began to use these food elements as metaphorical pieces in my artwork. For example, and they were giant, huge paintings. So one of them has enormous tomatoes that are in baskets of eggs. And for me, that was the personality of the female who is being trapped by her biology, the eggs. And another called House Arrest, where this tremendous tomato that you can't even see it, it's 7 feet wide, this painting, but you see these fried eggs over it like prison bars. So I played with the food in that way. And also, eventually, I began to think, well, maybe I could imagine that there was different thicknesses of glass over the paintings, and say, well, if I imagine that, then I'm going to change time and space. And then I imagined, and now we're getting to your question, that different layers of very realistic painting of foods were layered one on top of the other, illusionistically. And then I began to unpeel layers from layers that I had painted, all very illusionistically. And that's when I thought, maybe I'm using the canvas as an exploration of my own psyche.
But as a founding member of a Council of Women Artists, do you think there is something called feminist art, or there is a difference between women artists and men? And also if that difference holds more valid today?
Well, there definitely was a difference between female art and male art. And in fact, female art was not allowed, not showed, not even given any respect. In fact, I took part in a study where the adjectives and adverbs were used to describe men and women's art. And all those words that now men hope to find in their reviews, like lyrical, soft, layered, central, symmetrical, they were the words that were trash words for women's art at the time. So in terms of women's art at the time, yes, women were being permitted to paint whatever they want. They weren't going to be shown anyway. But the images were often centralized, often layered. They were soft in parallel. At the same time, the men were doing hard-edged steel boxes or reflective glass surfaces. No sense of personality in their work. Women's work always had personality embedded in the work. And as far as now, I would say that there's much more equality in terms of the images that women and men are producing. And there isn't that, certainly not in the US, there isn't that terrible discrimination against women artists that there was before 1970.
So would you say we are moving more towards androgynous kind of art?
I wouldn't call it androgynous. I would call it, because it depends who's making it. You can have a woman or a man who doesn't appear to be androgynous, but will create art for art's sake, let's say, rather than having particular images in mind. In that case, maybe it would be androgynous, but I wouldn't quite call it androgynous.
But feminist, maybe? Is there something called feminist art?
Today?
Today, yes.
Yes, there is. And one of the kind of cool things in the last few years was the beginning of the pattern and decoration movement in the US. And these were primarily started by women artists, a few women artists, who began to look at the tile work of temples from the East and took all that very articulated mathematical precision to create paintings, enormous paintings, using those mathematical techniques. And that was the beginning of pattern and decoration art. In the beginning of this, art critics scoffed at it and said, well, you know, it's been done. But then, because the art world at the time was so dry, other critics began to look at it, well, this is really juicy. This has a lot to look at. People love it, you know, they want to be with it, they want to live with it. So P&D is a relatively new offshoot of the feminist movement. There are certainly men now who are involved with the P&D movement, and it's a smaller but growing movement. One of the neat things in the last couple of weeks, I was visited by a curator in my studio in Los Angeles, and she had just put together a new exhibition in Boston, which she called Less is a Bore. And this has gained a lot of traction because the work that she selected was all full of imagery, full of work, full of craft, full of all the things that have disappeared in the last 30 years from the art world.
Because of minimalism.
Minimalism, post-minimalism, and installation, etc. Yeah.
But what do you think is the relationship between metaphor, form, and expression?
Form evokes feeling. Every time you see something, you have a psychophysiological reaction. Feeling conjures a metaphor. I feel sad, I feel happy, I feel joyful, I feel despondent by looking at something. And metaphor demands expression. So if I'm feeling sad because something, I'm looking at this ladder over here with those two stirrups, and for some reason that seems like some kind of torture device to me right now. You know, what do you do with those stirrups? But in any case, like an example, why are they there? Is it an art piece, a minimalist art piece? It could be, I'll tell you that, and could easily appear in some gallery. But so form evokes feeling. Feeling conjures metaphor. And metaphor demands expression. How are we going to deal with this change of mood that's changing our body? Because every time our mood changes, our neurotransmitters are changed. Here's a little example. If you just curl up the corners of your mouth, you're going to get a shot of serotonin, which is going to make you feel good. And even if you're feeling terrible and you're miserable and you curl up the corners of your mouth, you're going to get a shot of serotonin. So you'll feel better. So if anything that we see or anything that we think is going to cause a change in our psychophysiology, and that's really where the power of form lies. And I would bet that 99% of artists working have no idea of their power that they have in producing the forms that they produce. I think artists need to be really responsible about what they let go in the world for other people to see, because everyone is affected deeply.
So that also brings me to seeing and thinking, and as to what comes first.
Well, my feeling is a question. Do we see because of what we think, or do we think because of what we see? So if the neurons and the neural processes are arranged in certain patterns, we recognize that which reflects the shape of the neurons and the neural processes. Is it that the seeing evokes the neuronal process, or is that the neurons evoke the recognition over there? So it's a toss.
Chicken and egg.
Yeah, or egg and chicken. Now, why do we always say chicken and egg and not egg and chicken?
Yes, exactly. So you often draw from your own experiences.
Yeah.
Has there been a defining experience in your life which kind of shaped your trajectory of art?
Many defining experiences, which are always changing, like being here today, is certainly a defining experience. I find it just amazing that here I am in India, in Chandigarh, talking about my work with you, and it's being filmed. It's just, what a defining experience. I think that the major experiences in my life are the year I spent in 15 Asian cultures, and then the year and a half I spent alone in wilderness on the mountaintop with no power, no light, no electricity, no nothing, living with the big animals like bears, elks, deer, living in minimalist ways, always at the point of freezing to death in the winter when the temperature went down to 20 below zero. I was there in the time of the worst fire that Arizona ever had, and I was the only living creature there in that forest. The fire came so close that the chiggers, which are tiny insects, got buried in my eyeballs because that's where the liquid was, and I became blind for a while. Living like that in the wilderness on a mountaintop for a year and a half really gave me a sense of my connectedness into nature in a way that I never experienced before. And that has remained with me very profoundly. The other aspect of that experience was that seeing how the big animals lived. They live in herds. And I realized in my isolation that we humans are also herding animals, because it's only within herds that we can be heard. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I didn't spend the rest of my life alone in the wilderness, but I came back, as difficult as it was to come back, and I went back to my teaching position and back to living in the city and back to dealing with the noise and the craziness, because I understood that we are connectors and we need to be connected in order to be reflected, and that's how we have life.
That's very well put. You're talking of several cultures. Was India included?
Absolutely. India was very much included. And India is one of the very few places that I keep returning to. This is my 5th visit to India. And although it's changed, it changes. I see it just in the short 2 days that I'm here. There's still that sense of India that will always be India, while so many of the formerly very different cultures that I lived in are becoming gentrified, Americanized, Wendyized, hamburgerized overnight, and there's no culture left. And that to me is very disturbing. And that's another reason why I've been so involved with the restoration and perpetuation of alphabets and languages. We lose about 450 languages every year as languages become Romanized for computerization. And with that, when we lose a language, we lose the history, the poetry, the way of looking at a world that comes through a lens that is entirely different than any other lens. That is something that I don't know if we can stop, but at least we can preserve what we can. And that's one of my missions in life.
And that's why you use it often enough in your works?
Yes. And the forms, I had mentioned, I think, that I'd isolated 5 patterns, 5 forms. I found them in all alphabets, ancient to modern. And why these 5 forms? Because they mirror the neurology, which recognized them. Therefore, these forms, when I use them in my work, will cause a certain beneficial reaction in the viewer and also in myself while doing it. There is one of the nice things about the scale of this is that all my paintings are meant to be seen against the whole body, so that you have a reaction to it in your whole body, hopefully beneficial.
You also had a long association with Buddhism.
I have had a very unusual story with Buddhism. I grew up as a Jewish child in Montreal, and nobody ever heard of the Dalai Lama or Tibet or Buddhism or any of those things, but somehow I knew about it, and I spent most of my years asking people, did anybody ever hear of a Dalai Lama or something called Tibet? Nobody did. Nobody knew about this until I was a visiting artist in London at St. Martin's School of Art in '79. And I met a Canadian diplomat and asked him. And he said, oh yes, yes, there is such a place and there is such a person. So I was determined that I would go find this place and this person. And I took a leave from teaching for a year. I got a big giant grant from the National Endowment for the Arts from the US. And that's when I set off on my year in Asia. And I did find Tibet. And I did have extraordinary experiences there and elsewhere around Tibetan Buddhism. And since 1986, I've had a strong friendship with the Dalai Lama's biographer, who unfortunately died in '17. But the friendship made it possible, encouraged me to live in Dharamsala, live in the monastery, be treated in most unusual ways, and also coming to my home in Venice. So it's been a close, unusual, and yes, I did meet the Dalai Lama, and at one point I was charged with finding a residence for him and his 16-monk entourage when they came to Los Angeles. And it's totally a magical story. I've left out quite a number of details, but you know, it came from nowhere and it became a big part of my life.
But how did it change you as a person and your art?
Well, it changed me as a person considerably because the year that I spent on my mountaintop in Arizona, in March of that year, I received an invitation to come to Dharamsala when the Dalai Lama would, for the very first time, any Dalai Lama would give the ancient tantric teachings of compassion, bodhicitta. And so I left my snow-covered mountaintop and went to the snow-covered mountaintop up the road here and sat for 6 weeks with 300 monks and received these teachings. And the way that I was able to hear them, understand them, was that the previous time I had been there, I gave my transistor radio to a young monk, and in the interim, that young monk had become the Dalai Lama's amanuensis, and the only way that you could hear the teachings in translation was with that kind of radio. So he gave me back my old radio, and therefore I had the honor of hearing and being taught by the Dalai Lama himself about compassion, tantric compassion training. And yes, it did enter into my art very profoundly after I had a near-death accident on a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, which I survived. And then part of the survival had to do with painting very large diamond-shaped paintings in which I used these round balls that were coming up in the paintings that also mirrored the tantric teaching of visualizing compassion as a round ball that starts in the top of your head and nourishes your organs and systems throughout and then out the head, again to nourish the rest of the universe, all sentient beings. And I found that these balls were coming up in my paintings, and I felt that indeed, you know, this compassion coupled with calcium were healing paintings, and they appeared in all the right spots, the same as acupuncture, meridian spots, and other Eastern forms of healing.
But you talk about the power of art to heal.
Yeah.
So is it as a practitioner or is it the power to heal as a viewer?
It's both, because in creating and making every time you do a brushstroke, you are changing your body. It's a psychophysiological proprioceptive motion. Every time you create anything, that is a physical manifestation. You're changing your body. Then, by looking at it, you are visualizing a new reflection. And these are things that I also work with other people. I do what I call body mapping. People who have very strong illnesses, like cancer, for example, even kids as young as 2 and much older people. I've been asked to work with people all over the world, including the Aga Khan Hospital in Nairobi and other places. For every person, I will have a 6-foot piece of paper on the wall, and we'll trace that person against that paper, and we will have medical texts, and they will see, where is my illness? Is it here? What's its name? What do you call it? And then each person will draw or paint a new organ or a new system in a fully perfect manner, so that the actual visceral act of recreating a new organ, a new system, a new cell, is in itself a regenerating process. And the more faculties one uses in the visualization process, the more powerful it is. In Los Angeles and the US hospitals, they're now using visualizations as pre-op and post-op and even during op to make sure that the patient is involved in the healing. And the data is amazing.
And what took you and Ruth making films?
Well, this cosmography, the writing of the universe, after I first presented it in '81, I started getting requests to present it all over the world. And at the time, I was using 4 slide projectors, carousel slide projectors, giant elephants, and carrying them from place to place. And meanwhile, I had other ideas I wanted to pursue. I thought, okay, we'll put all of that information into a movie. And that was the first one, Cosmography, the writing of the universe, which it documents the discovery process in a really unusual way. We had to invent new ways to produce it so that the person who's watching it is going through the process in their own body, in their own mind. It's a very affective medium, an hour-long film that, interestingly enough, has more demand than it ever has at this time. And so that was released in '95, and then in 2000 I was asked by various educators if I could extract the nugget of the idea of cosmography and do something for kids of all ages. So I rethought the whole idea and came up with a new movie called Reading the Landscape. And this is I take this to 25 cultures around the world, following the migratory pattern of humankind. We start in Africa, then India, and then Israel, Egypt, Japan, China, Russia, Tibet, Navajo Nation, Yucatan. We're going around like this. And everywhere I have a cultural representative, and I've given that cultural representative 10 words, the same words in every culture. And as they say their words in their culture, and you see the country, you see the countryside, you hear the music, the whole culture is behind this person. The landscape rises as the person says the words, and the landscape rises to form the letters of the words. And it lands on the neurons which echo those shapes. And so we go from culture to culture to culture, and we see the same phenomena happening against the gorgeous differences that each culture presents.
But today filmmaking is almost a bona fide expression in visual art practice.
Oh, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
do you think it's more effective than a canvas?
Well, I think it's very rare to find someone who can wield a brush and create an image that is lasting, important, significant, changing the viewer. The training that it takes either by a teacher or by the self to be able to be a great painter is hard to find these days, and gets harder to find all the time because the emphasis is all on digital everything. So actually I had a wonderful experience yesterday at the Delhi College of Art where I had the privilege of seeing the graduate students work, and I was so impressed with the craftsmanship of the drawing and painting, the originality of the content, the way that they were so proud of each other's work. There was no sense of competition, and I was blown away because I haven't seen that kind of quality in terms of the craftsmanship and the originality and the outcome anywhere in so long. So yes, filmmaking is a very important medium. It is not easy to do. I have to say I spent 20 years making this Reading the Landscape film. Just finished it this year and had the premieres. But again, in my films, we have to invent a new way to make a film. And much like my paintings, every frame is very layered, and different things are happening on every layer, so that the outcome is absolutely magical.
Just like your paintings are.
Yes.
Very fascinating, I must say.
Well, thank you.
You've been teaching in US for a long time, and you must have given many nuggets of wisdom to your students. So what is it that you would like to tell our teachers as well as our students of art?
Well, first of all, I received very many nuggets of wisdom from my students over the years. And that's a very important part of teaching. It's a reciprocal process. And that's why it's a lively process. It's an alive process. And the more you give to a person who's wide open to receive, the more you will get back. I think teaching is a gift. And I've been grateful to have that gift for so many years. I never thought I would be a teacher. I was suddenly a teacher in graduate school when I was given a TA-ship, meaning a teaching assistant, and I had no idea what I would do. And I had to learn everything that I taught. And over the years, I've refined the processes in which I take students through on all levels. And I interact profoundly, and also all these things I've been talking about. How does this make you feel? When you're doing this, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? How can you make it different? These are important parts about teaching and learning. And learning something is not the end result of search. Learning something is the beginning of the next search. And I've always felt that I need to know everything. I mean, really, it's a very hubristic state of mind, but that's my search. I need to know everything so that I can make the connections. And I find the connections where people have never looked before. And that's the intriguing part of my life. I'm driven by my curiosity. I need to know everything. I'm voracious. And if I can impart that sense of needing to know everything to my students, then I've achieved more than I can imagine.
So curiosity may have killed the cat, but clearly it makes an artist.
Well put.
Here we are sitting in Chandigarh. I believe you visited the place before.
Yes.
Any thoughts on our city?
Well, it's beautiful. I was just driving around for a little bit today. I was struck by the greenness, the arboreal canopy everywhere, the sense of prosperity. And the first time I was here, I came to see the Corbusier buildings, but the city didn't look like this at that time. And now it seems, and I'm only here 2 hours, but it evinces a real sense of beauty, prosperity, and lushness that's beautiful.
East is East and West is West is very often heard dictum.
And never the twain shall meet.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And but you've traveled the world. What is your impression? Where do they meet? Do they meet?
They meet in the soul. And in the 60s, when Eastern philosophy came west, it really changed the West and has continued to change the West. And Eastern philosophy arrived at the same time as quantum physics became known. And the two of them are different metaphors of the same thing, and it all has to do with interconnectedness. And that's where it meets. I've been fortunate to travel back and forth many, many times, and I intend to do so much more. Now, we're talking East and West. I want to also talk about the top of the planet. That, when you talked about defining experiences, this is another one. When I shot the Eskimo part of my movie, Reading the Landscape, I literally had to go to the North Pole. It took 4 days to get there. The last was a flying saucer-shaped plane that went over the Arctic Circle, and at that point, the few of us who were in the plane, it felt like our heads were exploding. But that's nothing. So I got to this place called Cambridge Bay in Nunavut, which is the country that's now devoted to Eskimos, and they want to be called Eskimo, not Inuit. Eskimo means people who eat raw meat. Inuit means mankind. And I was invited by the founder of Nunavut, the George Washington of Nunavut. One night, I lay on the tundra at literally the North Pole, the top of the planet, and there, the aurora borealis is not up there, but it's covering, you can see it coming around the planet. And as I'm lying there, and the veils of light of all different colors are meeting and layering and passing each other by and creating the most extraordinary light show ever to be imagined, every time one of those colors touched the ice, a sound was emitted of the same frequency as the color. And then that sound was transmitted through the galaxies and the universe. It was like Bartok on drugs. So each of these frequencies, I'm looking at these amazing, sublime colors and music that was being played by the frequencies themselves and the echoing throughout the universe. That was a unifying experience, unlike any other experience that I had. And I highly recommend, if you have the opportunity to go to the North Pole, take it. Yeah.
So that had been most mesmerizing.
Yes.
But any shocking experience since you've been exposed to so many cultures?
I think most shocking is man's inhumanity to man and woman's inhumanity to woman, which I have seen over and over again. People call it war, people call it torture, people call it all sorts of things, people call it abuse. I think that is inevitably and always shocking, and that's what we need to fight against.
What, again, would you say that is universal or culture specific?
Maybe the form is more culture specific, but I think that unfortunately abuse is worldwide, and fortunately there's been more advances in the women's movement particularly, where women are coming out to talk about things that happened to them in a way that they weren't able to before. As far as country against country or culture against culture, or the way that various communities and cultures are chased out of their homelands and have nowhere to go, all these things are atrocities which we need to work on and change. And I think one of the great things that artists can do is to provide through their work, and what we do really is we align frequencies to make images. Every color has a different frequency, like the aurora borealis, and the way we align the frequencies is what the image looks like. And if artists would be more cognizant of the power that everyone has by creating an environment that is healthful, beneficial, providing a sense of peace rather than providing a sense of mayhem, we would be doing a really wonderful thing.
So do you think a lot before picking up a particular color?
I always think a lot, but I'd say by this time it's pretty intuitive, because I never know what this work is going to look like after the 9 months, let's say, of working on something. And I don't want to know. I want this thing to have its own life and to fill me with a sense of birth of something I've never seen before, that has its own dimension and articulation and has its own life.
And also you say intuition knows best.
Yes, intuition does know best. And intuition coupled with body feeling, and I'm sure you've experienced at some point in your life, maybe more, where you made a decision thinking logically and you began to feel nauseous, you began to feel uncomfortable in your body. That's when the intuition is taking over. Say, hey lady, not that direction. You're not feeling good. Step back.
But how much of art is intuitive and then craft?
I think the craft is the midwife of the intuition. Without the craft, you don't have anything. the better the craft, the more persuasive the image.
Right. We say men may make houses, but women make homes. But you design homes, you make homes for others as well.
Well, mostly I have made homes for others, but my own house I developed in the form of a spiral, and one walks around it in the form of a spiral. There's skylights in every room, so the sky is with us all the time. There's stained glass in every room. In fact, I was so audacious, I slightly changed the spectrum because I needed to have a certain kind of balance. And that spectrum wall is facing due west. Every June 21st, summer solstice, the 6 points of the spectrum, the sun sets through them, and a 6-pointed mandala forms on the table. And then for 7 days, this mandala walks down the middle of the house. So with all the skylights in the house, by the way, everything in the house is handmade. 14 kinds of hardwoods, a lot of shell material, natural materials. There's very little that is foreign in this house. And the house is now an art and architecture destination. There's also a roof garden that you can sit on it and see the whole of the LA basin and the ocean and the mountains. I also built a pond that is a fully self-sustainable natural ecology, with the fish and the water lilies never feed the fish, and a great big rock which works as a sundial. So I'm conscious in pretty much everything I do. What is the affect on the psychophysiology of the people who are going to be there? And this makes a big difference. So much of contemporary, or in the last 50 years, architecture is cold, impersonal, square. You know, some studies were done in about 20 years ago in New York, where they started to bulldoze down impoverished areas, and they built high-rises, and everybody got their own apartment for the first time. And the naysayers were saying, well, don't build something that is expensive and nice, they're going to wreck everything. On the contrary, these apartments were never defaced, because the sense of living in a much better, beautiful place changed people's psychophysiology. I think that the more we understand how much power we have in changing everything by providing a better kind of environment, then we'll go further.
And when you design for others?
I design the interiors. Mostly or I will be invited at a certain point where they're not happy about what it looks like. Then I'll come in and do something else. And by the way, my own bed is under an open skylight, so I sleep under the moon and the stars. And the rotation of the sun and the moon is part of the design everywhere.
And how many of your own artworks adorn your house?
Well, quite a few. Plus, I have the studio building that I built, and so it's full as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Gilah, for sparing your valuable time, and we hope to see you again in this city beautiful for more enriching conversations and a greater insight into your work and your enigmatic personality. Thank you on behalf of Punjab Lalit Kala Academy, and it's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been an honor for me, and I appreciate you very much in the way that you've phrased the questions and the width and breadth that you pulled into this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much.